Hello, everybody. Today's topic is the 1920s. It's a huge topic, so make sure you read the textbook chapter because I'm not going to cover everything here. But first, I want to talk about usually when we say 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, whatever, it's usually not from the beginning of 1920 to the end of 1929. It usually doesn't work out that way. But with the 1920s, it kind of does. So after World War I, some of the main objectives of the progressives happened. So women's suffrage and prohibition, particularly. And so those things happened in 1919 and 1920, and they basically marked the beginning of a new era. And the 1920s ended abruptly in October 1929 when the stock market crashed. So obviously, like the date didn't change, but the era, it was a new era. So the 1920s is kind of best looked at as an era of a culture war, similar to what we're experiencing now, where there was kind of like you have two sides. One side was like all in favor of modernism, cities, science, kind of progressive politics, technology. And these were usually people who lived in urban areas and maybe were a little bit younger. On the other side is sort of the conservative side, and they really valued things like American traditional values, Christian fundamentalism, tradition. They tried to stay away from big cities, or at least didn't approve of sort of the morals that were on display in big cities. So they mostly were like rural people who tended to be older. All right, so let's talk about both of these sides. Both of these sides experienced a lot of change during the 1920s. And the way it seems to me is that all the modernism started to come in after World War I ended. And these modern changes were threatening to the conservative side. And so they started opposing the modern changes. So then you have like modernism being opposed by conservative values, and it just creates this dichotomy where there's two different sides. So it definitely seems like the rise of conservatism was a direct result of modernism and how much modernism had changed American life. So some of the new things, if we're looking at these two categories, I'll start with the modern categories. Some of the things that propelled life into more modern ways during the 1920s was, well, first of all, women's suffrage went into effect in 1920. Um, I wouldn't call prohibition modern, but in the case of the 1920s, prohibition helped create a lot of modern culture, which we'll talk about. But other things that made the era kind of the beginning of modernism was cars. For the first time, many Americans could afford their own car. And this was largely because of mass production. Mass production made things cheaper because it made them quicker to produce. So we have cars and mass production. And radio, this was the first time that consumers had radios. During World War I, that was the first time radios were used, but it was for military use. So after the war ended, companies started producing radios for civilian use. And that definitely led to a lot of modern changes, just like cars did. And if you think about it, you could probably come up with a lot of ways in which those two things changed American culture. I'll just mention a few. So cars, first of all, helped lead to the growth of cities because people could work in the cities and live outside of the cities. So more and more people tended to move towards cities, and cities became bigger. Actually, the urban population doubled in the 1920s. Cars also led to access to see more ways of life, see more parts of the country. get out of maybe your little small town that you've never been out of before. So access to cars in a way propelled more like awareness and more openness to other ways of thinking and living. You probably know someone who's never left the small town they grew up in, or at least the state, and their views probably aren't super, maybe they've never had contact with people of a different race, or a different sexual orientation, or people from different countries. Whereas people in cities are most likely to have daily interactions with people who aren't like them. So urban life just helped increase modernism as well. Radio changed America in so many ways. Like, just think about it for a minute. First of all, it popularized music from other parts of the country. So before radio, you would only hear music that was made in your town or your region of the country. So it spread things like jazz music to the South. Country music began to spread through rural areas. It wasn't just confined to like the Appalachian mountain area. Now country music kind of spread to a lot of rural areas throughout the country. So more uh, awareness of different styles of music brought more awareness of different ways of living and different types of culture. Also, radio brought news to people very quickly. Obviously, this was something that did not exist before. People were used to not getting news until it was at least a day late. So radios provided that sort of instant news that people began to really rely on. Radio also, this is one of the things I'm most kind of fascinated with. Radio helped to erode regional accents. It helped to end regional accents. And I shouldn't say end, because we still have regional accents. I say y'all probably more than any other word from Mississippi. So there you go. But back then, regional accents were much more defined, because people had not heard other people talk. They would only hear voices in language from their region. So now with radios, you had people living in Mississippi who were hearing news and entertainers from New York City. So they began to talk gradually. People started to talk more like each other because they were hearing all these different accents. This influenced politics in a kind of an interesting way. That in 1924, there was a man running for president, Al Smith, and he was a New Yorker and a Republican, and he had a lot of support from throughout the country, until he went on the radio and started speaking. He was giving a campaign speech on the radio, and people in the South heard his really strong New York accent, and it made them cringe. It made them feel like, this guy's not like us. He's really different. He's not one of us. And so a lot of historians speculate that he probably would have won that presidential election if it weren't for radio, or if he didn't use radio to reach listeners around the country. So radio also helped popularize things like professional sports, because people could listen and get like on the spot live updates to what's going on, in wrestling, or like a boxing match or a baseball match. They could hear that live. Gosh, there's so much more. I just want y'all to think about how radios would have changed someone's life significantly. Think about what it was like before. Well, most of y'all probably didn't experience life before the internet and cell phones, but I did, and I remember, like, the way we did everything was different. If you wanted to go somewhere, you had to get directions. If you got lost, you had to like stop and ask somebody for directions. And that's just one example, but life changes so many ways, just having that connectivity and that instant awareness of international events. So a lot of this is because of World War I. During World War I, a lot of new technologies were created to help with communication, to help militaries communicate with their with their general, and keep the public updated about what's going on in the war. So those were very important to the war, and mass production was very important to the war as well, because the United States produced so much stuff. So after the war, a lot of those companies were like, well, we got, our business skyrocketed because we had all these orders coming in from war manufacturers, and they wanted us to produce tanks and radios and different kinds of bombs and poison gas and all this stuff. And so there were a lot of people buying American goods, and it lifted up the economy. And after the war ended, many economists were worried that now that the war's over, how can we maintain this economic growth that we just witnessed during World War One? And the way that they ultimately realized that they could keep that economy as high as it was during World War One is for those companies that were producing war goods, if they switched to producing consumer goods, maybe the economy would stay as high as it was. So that's what happened in the 1920s. There was a lot of movement towards consumerism. So more advertising. Radios were used for advertising, and they helped spread awareness of different types of products that you could buy, even if they weren't made in your small town, because now there was more sort of easier transportation from the east to the west and the north to the south. So you could order things that would be delivered to you that were made in an entirely different part of the country. So consumerism was pushed. And this is going to happen again, as we'll see, after the end of World War II. World War II, the economy skyrocketed for the same reason, war production. And after the war ended, there was this worry that, we've got to keep this production high. So if you start reducing the amount of production, that's going to lead to reducing your workforce, cutting their wages, which means that workforce now makes less money, and they have to limit their spending. So maybe, if you got laid off from your job, you're not going to go out to eat tonight, right? And so eventually that starts hurting like the local restaurants and movie places. And it leads them to sort of have to, maybe lay off some people, and then the cycle continues. So in order to not get like wound up in that cycle, consumerism was seen as the solution. If we just encourage people to buy all these new consumer products, we can keep the economy strong. And like I said, one way to encourage consumerism was through advertising and radio. But another way was the idea of buying things on credit, which really means buying things with money you don't have. The actual credit card itself wasn't invented until the 1950s, but layaway, buying things on credit, was a part of like 1920s culture. And it really was this idea that you should buy stuff. The previous sort of moral idea in American culture was about thriftiness, about saving money, that kind of thing. But in the 20s, people were just encouraged to spend money. So credit was a big one. This played into the stock market. And there's so much stuff about the 1920s. So the stock market became really a very popular way for people to make money. And it kind of started because of World War One. During World War One, the American government needed to raise money for the war, and so they started selling war bonds to Americans, and you could purchase one of these bonds, and that would be your sort of way to, help raise money for the American government. But after the war ended, the value of those bonds would increase. And so people started to sell those bonds in the 1920s, and they discovered that they made a lot of money off of that investment. And so, if you invest in something and you make money, you're going to want to do that again. So people just got this taste for investing. And so more and more people started investing into the stock market. And with radio, they could get like daily reports of how stock prices were doing. So there was more openness to sort of like investing and kind of really gambling. Women became seen as the prime consumers. And so a lot of these commercials on radios for different products were products that were mostly targeted towards women, such as dishwashers, ironing boards or electric irons. I wonder if people even know what ironing boards are anymore, but all cleaning products, so all kinds of like soap and laundry detergent and all this stuff. And so these products were advertised on daytime radio because they were trying to reach women, and the idea was that women are at home during the day. So um for instance, like cleaning products, soap products would want to advertise during the day, and that's where we get the name soap operas. They would create these television shows that were geared towards women so that they could reach women with advertisements of products that they thought women would be interested in. So soap operas. um Other modern changes include technology, a lot of advancements in technology. And again, this was a result of World War I, because, as we discussed last week, technology was a big part of increasing America's power and our allies' power during the war. So all kinds of new things were invented, like airplanes. It was the first war in which airplanes were used to attack, enemies. And so airplanes, of course, radios, poison gas, unfortunately, was another technological innovation. Tanks, different types of bombs that had not been used before. So there's all this push towards technology. And so after the war ended, people wanted to keep like exploring technology. And so airplanes became, for the first time, available to civilians and not just military personnel. So this was the decade in which Charles Lindbergh flew around the world. And so people were beginning to get really excited about technological innovations. This kind of attitude was really young and sort of new. And many people that didn't like this sort of consumerist, modernist culture started to like become more active in opposing it. So there was a lot of opposition to modernism. Cars, I know, I'm sorry, getting back to cars, but think of all the industries that cars would benefit. So of course, car production companies, but also like glass production for windows, rubber production for tires, and road paving. So it brought a lot of growth to the economy in many different ways. Motels, highways like Highway 66 became kind of these well-known highways where people went from one part of the country to another. And all along those highways, people built businesses that would attract drivers going on that route. And so you have things like motels, gas stations, convenience stores, diners, even like places to get your car fixed, all this stuff. It created new industries throughout the country on those roads. All right, where to begin? So much. Let's talk about prohibition. So in previous videos, we've talked about like the causes of prohibition, but now we're going to look more at like what prohibition actually did. So prohibition went into effect in January 1920. And it said, the law said that all alcohol consumption and distribution is now illegal. There were a few exceptions to this. Like if you were Catholic, you could still do first communion at the church and get like a little taste of wine. And so a lot of people turned more Catholic during this era so they could get their wine. But others that had sort of exemptions to prohibition would be doctors. They could prescribe medications that contained a certain amount of alcohol, but for the average consumer American, alcohol was illegal. However, it didn't work. Prohibition didn't work at all. People defied the law left and right. And so prohibition created a culture where it became normal to break the law. It became socially acceptable to break the law. Speakeasies were built all over the place. They were like underground bars where people would go drink illegally. And this is where we have the term underground. That's where it came from. Underground means like illegal or hidden, but in the 1920s, it was actually underground. In New York City, if you go there today, walking around, there's like music venues everywhere. If you go into some of these music venues, you immediately walk down a set of stairs, and then there's the bar and, you know, the live music. So those were speakeasies. They were literally underground, like downstairs, but they were so popular in big cities, and people would go there, like respectable people would go there all the time, and they would see like their mayor, their councilman, maybe their kid's teacher, or different members of society that were supposed to be like respectable. And so it kind of created this culture where it was okay to break the law, almost openly, really. There wasn't a lot of repercussions for breaking prohibition laws because of corruption. All these people who were supposed to be enforcing prohibition, they were very easy to bribe. So bars that served illegal liquor didn't really have to worry about being caught, because if prohibition agents came in there and they were like, hey, we need to inspect your premises, the normal thing was for the bar owners to bribe them and say, you know, here's some money, just go on your way. So bribery and corruption became much more a part of the American political system. But this is also why prohibition was just so blatantly ignored. But prohibition had effects on women as well. Before prohibition, it was very socially unacceptable for women to drink in public. Bars and saloons were strictly like men's places. The only women who would be in those sorts of places were prostitutes, or they were assumed to be prostitutes, because no like self-respectable woman would go into one of these places. That changed with prohibition. The speakeasies started to really try to attract more women in their bars, and they did this by encouraging things like live music, jazz, dancing, which a lot of women, you know, love to do. And they also created cocktails. So before prohibition, it was just normal to drink liquor straight. But because they were trying to increase their female clientele, they started creating all these like, you know, sugary, very sweet cocktails that they thought women would like. So speakeasies helped to spread jazz music and a sort of a kind of a rebellious culture. And this is a big part of like forming like what it meant to be kind of a modernist in 1920s America. It kind of meant that you maybe didn't follow all the laws or the expectations, and that was okay. So prohibition also led to the rise of the mafia. There had, prior to the 1920s, there had been kind of limited extortion groups that were mostly Italian Americans, but it wasn't really the mafia. The mafia itself didn't happen until prohibition happened. And it's because they, members of the mafia realized that they could make a lot of money by bringing liquor in from other countries. So just transporting liquor illegally. So most of what they did was bring in rum from places like Cuba and Canada. And as a result of that, they became known as rum runners. But again, they didn't have a lot of fear of being arrested, because they could just so easily bribe any member of the Prohibition Department. So the mafia started to become a lot more powerful, and it grew tremendously during the 1920s. So organized crime grew in a lot. Different mafia gangs would compete for dominance in a certain city. And this was most closely seen in Chicago. Y'all might have heard of Al Capone, like a big time gangster in Chicago. He kind of controlled liquor transportation to Chicago. And when there were rival gangs that were sprouting up in Chicago and that were trying to take this from him, they tended to, you know, be very violent, and a lot of that violence was very public. So people began to have more awareness of what the mafia was and how it was contributing to helping Americans get past prohibition. So this leads to another sort of modern idea. Several members of the mafia became looked at as celebrities. So Al Capone was probably the best example. Everyone knew he was breaking the laws. Most people knew that he was involved in murder, but they still liked him. He did a lot for communities and in order to win like the support of the communities. So in Chicago, he established like soup kitchens for homeless people. He donated tons of money to different organizations, and it created like this really good reputation for him. And so he became one of the first celebrities. And in this case, and many other cases, the celebrities were kind of borderline criminals. This happened in many different areas of culture. So in movies, celebrities were often portrayed as criminals, and people began to really just kind of give celebrities a lot of attention, and they placed a lot of value on celebrity status. Because think about it, if you go to a movie and the movie all of a sudden has sound, you're going to be you're going to feel like you know those actors a little bit better, because you're hearing them talk, and there's music in it for the first time. So people just became more aware of celebrities, especially because of radio as well. And the mafia and other well-known criminals often became celebrated as celebrities while also being criminals. If y'all have seen the movie Chicago, this is a great example of what I'm talking about. Like these women in a Chicago prison, they were there for murdering their husbands, but they're portrayed as celebrities. And so the public tended to look at them as celebrities instead of, murderers. So just this kind of celebrity culture developed. Members of the government never wanted to prosecute people like Al Capone because they received a lot of benefits from leaving him alone, basically ignoring him. They received bribes, they received lots of donations, and they had the support of the public. Most of the public did not want Al Capone to be convicted and put in prison because he supplied the alcohol that they really wanted. So blackmail changed bribes changed really American politics. It just became very common. An example of this is that the Prohibition Bureau knew that Al Capone was bringing in all this illegal liquor, but they could never arrest him on anything. They tried for years to convict him of something, but it never would happen because nobody was willing to testify against him. And that was probably partly out of fear of retaliation by the mafia, but it was also because like they looked at him as like a celebrity, and they kind of liked him. So eventually the only way that Al Capone got arrested was through tax evasion, because he had not been paying taxes on the money he made from his illegal transporting of liquor. So he was only convicted under the IRS for that's even though he murdered people. But that just shows how acceptable alcohol was in American culture. Okay, I'm gonna just end this here and create another video because I don't want to go too long, but please watch the next one as well. Thank you.